and welcome back. I'm here with Steve James, the director of Stevie. Hi, Steve.
Hello.
So I want to start off the conversation with kind of going back to in your mind to the 1990s and what really inspired you to check in with Stevie in the first place. Was it your wife saying, "Oh, have you heard from Stevie?" Like what even started this idea of a project?
Yeah, I think it was two things. One was I'd not been back to Southern Illinois in quite a while. We moved up here in '85. I got wrapped up in doing Hoop Dreams and just trying to get a career underway. And so I hadn't been back. I'd sent Christmas letters to Stevie in that time period and heard from him once, but we'd pretty much lost touch. And so suddenly with Hoop Dreams coming out in '94, there was a lot of activity and the school asking me to come back there for various things. So I found myself headed down there on a trip. And right before that happened, I was getting my hair cut, I remember, and I was reading some magazine. And in the magazine, it was a story about someone who had been a big brother who had decided to reconnect with their little brother after years. And I was like, oh my God, there's a chance I could actually see Stevie. And so I'd already told him I was coming back down. And so I called him back up and I said, what do you think about the idea of actually filming? And he was like, sure, you know, and his situation sounded pretty tame. He was back living with his grandmother. He was doing odd jobs and that sort of thing. And so I thought, okay, I'll just go down there and we'll do a little short portrait of Stevie now, basically 10 years since I was his big brother. That was the initial impetus.
Yeah, and then of course it took a whole other turn in process. So within the Cinema's Legacy program this year, everyone being kind of isolated and in this extended quarantine, we're talking about reflection and how that works within nonfiction filmmaking. And I think that for Stevie, it wasn't set out to be a personal doc in any way, but here, some things happen and you start to examine yourself in that relationship. So I'm kind of curious about what point in the process did that connect with you, and was there what was your perspective on personal docs and realizing, oh, this is now where this has to go, and am I examining, is this okay, do I want that?
Yeah. No, I actually, honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of personal docs, and did not intend. I knew that if I did the short as planned, that it would have a personal aspect to it, because I had maintained a journal when I was his big brother, and I went back and reread that, and I thought, it might be good to include some of those journal entries, and so that would make it personal. But you would just hear my voice, and that would be it. I had no intention of being in the movie at all. And interestingly enough, on the very first shoot, though, Adam Singer, who was one of the producers and did sound, and is a good friend, and Peter Gilbert, who worked on the film at that time, who was also my partner on Hoop Dreams, they convinced me to let them film me meeting him again for the first time in 10 years. They just said it would be good to have it. You don't have to use it. And I was like, oh, I don't think so, but I knew that I could ultimately decide not to use it. And so I said, okay, fine. But yet I still had no intention of really being in the film. And then it really changed when I reached back out to him after the initial filming a couple of years later, after I went off and did this other film, Prefontaine, and found out that he had just been arrested. And at that point, when I made the decision that I wanted to continue to make the film, and I convinced him to do so, I I realized that if I was going to make this film, then I had to make it more personal, because I realized I was going to be in some ways stepping back in to my role as a big brother, trying to provide some guidance or support for him through this situation. And that the only honest way to make that film, if I should even make that film, was to make myself a part of it. And part of the reason I wasn't a big fan of personal films is that I had a tendency to feel like the ones I'd seen tended to be self-indulgent and kind of and also the question I always ask when I see a personal film is, how much more enriched is this story by the presence of the filmmaker? And there are a lot of times when I've seen films over the years where I thought, nah, I don't think it was worth that. I don't think that enrichment was worth that. And so that's why I was very reluctant and loath to go down this path, at least initially.
Yeah. And so it took a little convincing, it sounds
It
like.
took convincing, and it took a change in the whole direction of the film, right? And now it was no longer going to be a portrait of a kid that I was once a big brother to years before, and sort of here he is now. It was going to be what's going to happen to this young man who I was once a big brother to, who's now facing some very serious charges. What's to become of his life?
Yeah, I think there's a really beautiful moment. It's small, but it speaks volumes to what the film really is talking about, which is and I can't remember which, is a kind of a one-off character, but he says, like, what do you do when the village fails? Yeah. What do you do? Like, what is our responsibility to each other? And I would love to kind of hear, your thoughts on how that resonates to this particular, to tell the story, but also the ethical choices you made in wrestling with how much to insert yourself and how much to call responsibility to yourself in this relationship, because filmmaker and subject is always a part of documentary filmmaking,
right?
But this is just a different kind of hornet's nest, so to speak, of what you're putting yourself into.
Yeah. I think with a film like this, it starts, the very first question is the one I alluded to a little while ago, which is, should I even make it? I mean, I have this relationship to this young man that goes back to when he was a kid, and I had spent about 3 years as his big brother. So I'd had a pretty substantial time with him before I left for Chicago. And so now he finds himself in this terrible situation. His life is clearly a mess in so many ways, even beyond what he's been arrested for. That's become clear. And should I make this film? Who am I making this film for? And what is my reason for doing it? And I thought a lot about that, and I decided I wanted to make it, and it wasn't a fair fight, you could say, when it came to me convincing him to go along with it. I think one thing that documentary filmmakers are good at is persuasion. And it's sort of a big part of what we do. And I was determined, though, not to try to get him to go along with it because we were going to exonerate him. I made it very clear in that initial conversation with him that if we do this, that I believed that his confession was true, that he gave, and that he was probably guilty, and that I wasn't looking to do a film to exonerate him. So he heard that, but he also responded to the fact that he wanted people to know about his life, and particularly about what had been done to him growing up, that was part of his motivation for wanting to do it. And frankly, it was part of my motivation too, in the sense that, my wife, who's still my wife, she's upstairs right now, she worked with sex offenders, right? You learn that in the course of the film. And so she'd had this relationship with sex offenders that's very different from what regular people have, of course, because she's working with these guys. And so there was something about that crime and my relationship to him and her work that made me think that there's something important that could be told here as a story about people like Stevie. Because as she says in the film at one point, sex offenders are considered worse than murderers. And that was true then, and I think it's pretty much true now. And so I did feel like there was some higher purpose to what I was doing by pressing forward and making this story. But I could just have easily arrived at the decision that this would be so exploitative of a tragic situation that I have no business telling the story. And I even like to say that if I was a better person and a less ambitious filmmaker, I might have arrived at that conclusion, and I might have helped Stevie without making a film. I might have acted in that role as Big Brother without making a film. But I also know myself well enough to know, and I think I'm probably deviating from your question here, but I also know myself well enough to know that when I look at the process of having made that film, the truth is, if I hadn't made the film, yes, I like to think I would have remained in his life and tried to be helpful, but it would not been nearly to the degree that it was by making a film with him and on him. I was much more involved in his life. I was much more present in his life. And again, that doesn't let me off the hook for anything. It's just the truth about me and this film.
I mean, obviously, exploitation of film subjects is a topic that comes up a lot in filmmaking, and obviously this film I know upset some people at the time because it they felt like that. They were uncomfortable with the film, which I think is what makes the film so powerful to watch, is how much space you give to the complexity of this family, this person, these relationships. So as a filmmaker, what kept you kind of in check on that process of the project and not like lose yourself in that? Because I think it can be a very slippery slope, and it's hard to achieve that. What was it like? Yeah. Was it editing while you were shooting? Was it how you kind of talked with others? Like what helped?
Yeah. Well, no, we didn't. I didn't really engage in any editing for while we were shooting, and that's mainly because there was another project or whatever that I was involved with, and we didn't have any money on Stevie. So for me to devote time to it was going to have to totally be on my own time, and I didn't have a lot of time when I wasn't shooting with Stevie to devote to it. I think that it would have been very possible to make this film with me having virtually no presence in it, maybe a little bit. And I still think it would have been a rich portrait of a guy that society tends to want to throw away, and a complex family situation and dynamic in this, rural hamlet of Southern Illinois. But I think it would have also been a dishonest film, in that it wouldn't have taken into account the complexity of the fact that I am making this film about a desperate situation like his. And whether you put yourself in those films or not, it raises those questions, right? That fundamental question of documentary, which is, do we have the right to tell these stories? Or are there stories where people, especially people who are going through tremendous suffering and tragedy, should their lives be put on a screen for people to consume and take in the way we watch films? Those are fundamental questions that, whether you put yourself in a movie or not, every filmmaker kind of needs to wrestle with, right? But I felt like in this film, it needed to be wrestled with in the making. And at a certain point, once I committed to doing it, I tended to be more ruthless with myself about the way I was going to try to present myself in the film. In other words, I did not want to fall into a trap of either making the whole film about myself, like Stevie's just fodder for my ruminations on ethics and documentary. I didn't want that at all. On the other hand, I didn't want to soft pedal those questions either in my portrayal. So, one of the things I discovered when I started editing was some of the embarrassing things that I said that I didn't even remember saying, like when Stevie came to my house and I'm showing him our house, it's this house, we're still in the house. I was like, well, this is the living room. We the house isn't done yet. And he's like, well, it looks pretty good to me. And it's like, yeah, compared to his trailer in Pomona, we're living in splendor here, and it was like one of those classic, like middle-class white sort of apologies that people do where you're taking no account of who you're speaking with. And it just sounds, I seem like such an idiot to me when I saw that footage. Or there were other places where, anyway, I'm getting rambling on, but one of the things I tended to be pretty hard on myself, and my colleagues tended to say, yes, you need to be hard on yourself, but you also need to be fair in terms of how you portray yourself in this. And so they kind of pulled me back. But there was one exception, which is an important one, which was at a certain point, I brought Bill Hogsey on as one of the editors. And Bill was someone that I'd worked with on Hoop Dreams. And Bill's a very talented editor. He's based in LA now. And he was then. And when I was out there in LA on a project, I got him involved in editing because I needed another editor voice perspective on this film. And Bill, when he first looked at my rough cut, he said to me, no, it's honest and it's really interesting. He said, but I feel like you're making so many admissions about the ethical questions of you making this film that it almost feels like it's a backdoor effort to gain the sympathy of the audience. And he was so right about that. He was absolutely right about that. In other words, if I'm constantly saying, oh, what am I doing? Why am I making this film? Or the equivalent of that, at a certain point, it becomes me trying to tell the audience, see, I'm a sensitive guy. I'm beating myself up over this. So maybe you don't beat me up over it. And he was so right about that. And so his involvement, among many things that he contributed, was to try to zero in on how much of that should the film have, and really give the audience real permission to hate me.
Mm-hmm.
They want to hate me.
But I think that's a vulnerability that a lot of filmmakers are scared to take. And so yeah. I think that's why also a lot of people are drawn to this movie, because it's rare. And I think another one of those moments, I mean, maybe I don't know if this was one of the conversations, but the scene with you and the white supremacists, like that, and I think too, like you're thinking about the context of today and how people are divided or not talking or speaking to each other. And there you are, you're having a conversation that a lot of people in general may not want to have or be recorded of them having. It sticks out.
I'm glad you brought that scene up, because that's another one where Bill made a tremendous impact. This is also where I learned this valuable lesson about how selective memory is. Because I did the first edit of that scene, right? And when I looked at before I looked at the footage, I had a certain idea of how that all went based on my memory of it, right? Mm-hmm. And then when I looked at the footage, I was amazed at how much this white supremacist guy was just toying with me and, being in charge and also treating Stevie like he was a peon that was just, his fate was to be decided by him and maybe me. And I was appalled at how poorly I handled it. Right? How undone I became by it. And this is one of the places where I was editing, I didn't have the courage. I cut the scene more like the way I remembered it than the way it happened. And when Bill first got involved, he said, I want to see all the dailies. And I was like, and I didn't immediately think of that, but I was just like, you want to see everything? He goes, yeah, I need to see what you left out. So he watched all the dailies and he recut that scene. And that's the scene that's in the movie where you see the struggle of that conversation much more palpable and viscerally. And as soon as I saw his version of it, I was like, you're right, that's what's got to go in the movie. But I mean, yes, those were the kind of moments that are difficult. And one of the things people have told me that like the film, because some people like the film, is that one of the things they appreciate about the film is that because of my presence, it puts them in this position in the audience of having to decide for themselves what they would do with a Stevie in their lives, instead of just sitting back safely in the dark and watching in judgment about this guy and his family and what has happened. That my presence and my wrestling with these issues throws it back on them too, not as filmmakers, but as people. And so many of the letters I've gotten from people over the years via email, sometimes by post, oddly enough, Stevie, I've gotten more personal letters from Stevie than any other film of mine, period, maybe combined. And it's probably one of the least seen of my films in any kind of number sense. Yeah. But what motivates people to write me is not so much the filmmaker moral dilemma. It's usually like I have a Stevie in my life. It may not be a sex offender. It may be some other troubled soul. Mm-hmm. It may be a relative. It may be a friend. It may be a son or daughter. And they write me because they really connected with me and that struggle of trying to help someone who is in a very bad place and oftentimes doesn't want the help.
Yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about the film. It's this own kind of therapy, personal connection that you end up taking with in a way that a lot of films can't achieve.
Yeah, I love it. I love it when people tell me that at the end of the film, when he's going off to prison, and I've had a few people tell me this independently of each other, that they don't know they don't know how to feel. They feel sorry for him, but they also feel he needs to pay for what he's done. And they're just really torn. And that's exactly how I felt.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I mean, the ending, there's no satisfaction in this ending, which I think is also not typical for what is supposed to be a film that's out there in the world and sold and put up on a platform and whatever, So, that again is part of the uncomfortableness that sits with the audience. But was there any, like, at any point did you think, I can't end it this way, or like at what point did you know, okay, this is how it has to end? I have to sit with this as an ending that is not gonna satisfy people, or
Well, at the time I wasn't sure how people would feel about the ending. They might want to stand up and cheer, this guy's going off to prison, for all I know. I mean, I didn't know. I think it became clear to us as we were going along, in the same way that on Hoop Dreams, it became clear to us that probably the end of the movie is when these kids go off to college, essentially. It was a realization that the end of Stevie is going to be whatever happens to him, if he goes off to prison or he's free. Mm-hmm. And then at a certain point, it became clear, because he was going to do a plea deal, that he was going to go to prison. So I think we knew that was going to be the ending. And how people would feel about it, I don't know. I don't think I had the presence of mind or perspective yet to know, because frankly, I was so worried that people would just reject this film because of who it's about, not even thinking about how they might look at me, but just how they might look at him, and not want to see a film. I mean, this was the hardest film to raise money for that I've made. And this was the film I did after Hoop Dreams. This was a film that, when I told people I was working on a new documentary, they'd be like, oh, Ray, yeah, really interested to see it. And yet no one gave us money except the BBC gave us a little bit of money, and the CBC, and then a private investor who became one of the executive producers, Robert May, and who's a good friend of mine now, and I've worked with in other ways. He came on board and saved the film financially to get it made because nobody wanted to fund this film. I would get rejection letters that said, I can't muster enough sympathy to want to see this film get made. So I wasn't sure how people would see the end of this movie. I wasn't sure anyone would see the end of this movie.
Mm.
And fortunately, we finished it and they did.
How has time changed the way people, or has it not changed the way people talk with you about this film? And how maybe has your view on, I mean, we've kind of talked through about it much being in the present, but now that it's been, I haven't calculated the years, but like
long time.
a long time since even the release, but before that, the making of it, but like, how has time changed the way the conversation around the film and maybe your own view of the film?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it'll be 20 years next year since it was released, but we started shooting it in 1995.
Yeah.
So even longer, to be more like 27 years since we began it next year. So, I wrestled with whether I should be making it. Throughout the process of making it, I obviously came to the conclusion it should be made, and we made it, and it went out there. And I didn't even when people attacked me over the film, it was hard to read that stuff and see that. But I wasn't sorry we made it, because I heard from enough people and from enough reviewers too that responded to the film. And when my wife went to work for this agency here in Illinois that she worked with for the last dozen years, she literally just retired. The first day she went there, it was an environment for sex offenders who were still incarcerated after their sentence that she was working with, a very difficult population. When she got to the facility, she found out that they'd been showing the film at the facility. They had to stop now that she was there. It was a problem because she was in it. But I'd hear stories like that, or other places where it was being used, and I would feel like, or in universities where, not just in film courses, but like in sociology classes, and places where it's about not filmmaking but about other stuff, foster care and whatever. I'd hear about the ways in which it was used, and it made me feel like I did do the right thing by us making this film. And then, of course, all those letters and emails that I've gotten from people over the years has only made me feel even more so, because I feel like it is too few people have seen it. That's what every filmmaker will say about every film they've made. But I know it's had an impact on people who do see it. And in the film community, it's been interesting because I probably get as many people, and maybe more, filmmaker types who come up to me at a festival or something and say that Stevie is their favorite film of mine. That happens, I think, more than Hoop Dreams and more than anything else I've made, that people say that's the one that is their favorite. And I have to say that does make me feel good too, because I feel like it's a film that's speaking to filmmakers, not just the story I tell, but also what it ruminates on in terms of these issues.
So I've got one more question and then we have to wrap it up, but I think everyone is always curious to know if you've kept in touch with the family, and if you've kept in touch at all, or have any idea about Stevie, Brenda, or even Tanya now. I think Bernice and his grandmother have passed away since, right?
They have passed away, yes. I went down for grandma's funeral, and it was good to be there for that. And Bernice passed away a few years ago, and she sort of stayed in touch with me. It's funny, she would call me up about things that were upsetting her, which was, we ended up kind of having this strange, I mean, not often, but it's almost like we bonded over this in some way, even though, the portrayal of her is certainly quite candid. With Stevie, I stayed in touch with Stevie all through his prison term, which ended up being 11 years. and I would visit him occasionally, and I would send him a little bit of money for the commissary there so he could get things. He actually became pen pals with a black woman on the South Side. It's too long a story to tell now how that happened, but I acted as a liaison between her and him for a while, which if there ever was going to be a sequel, those two together would have been the sequel to do. When he got out of prison, finally, he was living with a stepsister that's not in the film. And I was in touch with him there, and we had saved some money for him through the different festival prizes and things that the film won. And we'd put some money aside for him, for Brenda and Doug, and for the mother, the victim, and the mother of the victim, Wendy, and her daughter. And so it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a little bit of money to help him when he got out to try to get settled. And of course, then I had to deal with him wanting it all at once so he could go buy a leather jacket and have a big party. And I was like, no, we're not going to do that. You know, I was back into being Big Brother again. So I was in touch with him then. He finally saw the film. I wasn't able to show it to him in prison. And he finally saw the film, but he really didn't want to talk about it. The only thing he really said was, well, it sure ain't Hoop Dreams. That's what he said. And I said, no, it's not Hoop Dreams. I said, but what do you think? You want to talk? And right about then, you know, he hemmed and hawed, and he said, there's somebody at my door. I got to go. And he never really wanted to talk about it again. And I lost touch with Stevie when I insisted on Brenda becoming his payee for this this money that we had set aside. She was willing to do that to kind of make sure he spent it wisely. He did not like that. I lost touch with him. He stopped talking to me for a while. Then he got rearrested. He was in prison in Louisiana for several years. Then he was out, then he was back in, and I've lost touch with him through that time. I mean, my phone numbers stayed the same, everything. If he wanted to reach out to me, he could, but he hasn't. So I've lost touch with him at this point. But Brenda's doing well. She and Doug are still married. They have 3 kids. And she's, you know, she's a real rock in that family, how it has always been. And I've stayed in periodic contact with her to just check in with her and see how she's doing. I lost touch with Tanya. I don't know any way to get a hold of her. So I don't know what Tanya's up to. So.
Wow.
Well,
go. Thank you, Steve, for being here and talking about this film. I feel like we could talk all day long about it.
Well, I can ramble on and on too, as you see.
Oh, it's been lovely. It's an incredible film, and I think that we're all just very grateful that you could spend some time to talk about it again. It's being so special to you and special to a lot of people out there. So thank you all at home for watching. Thank you, Steve, for being here. And AFI Docs continues until June 27th. So hope you'll check out some more films. Thanks.